Hello guys, this is Reza. In this class, we're going to talk about unwrapping. So the aim of this lesson is to understand what UV unwrapping is and its usefulness. Also, the ability to create and edit UV coordinates for your asset is important, so we hope to achieve that. Also, a good understanding of the core considerations when you UV unwrap an object. So let's get to it. So let's talk about what UV mapping is. So I've got a model here, and this has already been UV mapped. Now, we don't see it right now, but we should know that UVs are a component of any 3D geometry that allow you to map a 2D image. It can be a color, it can be a texture, any sort of bitmap to the 3D geometry. Now, the process of editing UVs is referred to as unwrapping. So you unwrap an object and then you apply the texture. Now, right off the bat, we don't see any information here because my workspace is set to Maya Classic. If you set your workspace to Maya Classic, then all UV mapping tools will be placed here under your UV dropdown and will stay here as long as you're in modeling submenu. For a more convenient workspace, I would always switch to UV editing. And as soon as I do that, you can see that the model comes up on the left hand side and all the UV information in 2D comes up in the right hand side. This window is called UV editor, and if I go to UV, I can access the floating version of this window from this drop down here. Now, the term UV refers to the 2D coordinates of the space that these components are laid out within. The horizontal axis, this axis right here, is the vertical axis is V, and the horizontal axis is U. So this is U horizontal and this is V vertical. Now, by default, the image is mapped to a square defined by 0 to 1. And it is often referred as 0 to 1 space. So I usually say every single detail or UV mapping information that you have should be placed within 0 to 1 space. And by saying that, I mean this space right here when you have 0 to 1 Maya units. So remember, this is U and this is V, 0 to 1, 0 to 1. We need to establish some ground rules. The first ground rule is any UV shell, and each one of these guys we call them UV shell. If I right click, I can actually select a UV shell and toggle between different UV shells. And if you look down here, hopefully it's visible in the video, it says I've got 1 out of 7 UV shells selected. To jump out of UV shell, I simply right click on the 3D model and switch back to object mode. Now, you may ask, well, where do we fit UV unwrapping in asset pipeline? So when we finish the model, then we UV map it so we can apply textures to it. Usually default primitives, if I go to create, polygon, sphere, or any of those for that matter, if I go to the option box, there is a way to create a default UVs right off the bat. Usually we override those UVs with our customized UVs, but you can tick them off if you wish not to have any UVs on the primitives to begin with. But Those UVs sometimes can be helpful. Sometimes they can give you some good starting points, but we wish not to use them for now. The second ground rule is the textile density. Now, if the UV shells have different textile densities, then the result is going to be pretty bad. For example, if I select this UV shell and then press R on my keyboard and scale this down and just enable my guide checkerboard, you can see now all of these guys, the other shells are quite same size, but all of a sudden the textile density in this one is pretty small, which can result in a texture quality discontinuity. So we want to make sure that everything is proportionate to what we have as a 3D model. And so every time I say be mindful of your textile density, it means that you may need to have some minor adjustments when it comes to the scale of each shell in your scene. Now, there's another concept that I may refer to, and that is real estate. Now, real estate, texture real estate, refers to how much of the texture space you use or you utilize for this UV mapping. So if I select everything and shrink them down, I'm gonna turn off my checkerboard. So you may notice that the textile density is consistent, but we are only using maybe 20% of 0 to 1 space that we have. And that will result in poor quality, and that is a good definition or good example for poor use of real estate, texture real estate. So we want to make sure that we make use of that 0 to 1 space as much as we can, because the bigger the shells are, the cleaner the textures will look. So always think about that. That is another ground rule that you need to be mindful of. Also, readability is a big thing. I'm looking at this shell right here, and I kind of know that this is the actual face for this character. So you don't want to have 200 shells and not knowing which one is representing what area exactly. I always aim for fewer but quite readable shells. So good readability is a big thing, and this is especially important when you're using 2D painting programs such as Photoshop to paint over your UV shells to build your textures. If you have 5 shells, it's much easier to make use of textures inside Photoshop to line them up with the UV shells than 200. Which sometimes, if your readability is poor, it makes it almost impossible to apply textures to your UV shells. Now, let's review what we discussed. We try to make sure that there is no distortion. We try to make sure that there is all the shells are within 0 to 1. We should be mindful of our texture density ratio, and we also need to think about the healthy real estate and readability of our UV shells. So that's one small thing before we start implementing UV tool sets to our model. Now, before I start with applying UV texture or UV mapping tools, let's go over the interface really quick. You may have noticed that I have UV editor to see my UV shells, and I have my UV toolkit to find the tool that I want to refine, polish, or apply my UV tools. So the first one, this area right here, we call this coordinate viewport. And this is an area where UVs can be directly interacted with. We have a menu on the top, and many of the UV functions can be accessed through this menu. Then we have this menu right here, and it's the UV Toolkit. Was introduced a couple of years ago from 3D Max into Autodesk Maya, and it contains most of the tools typically used for editing the UV layout in a really interactive, nice way. And of course, we have some icons in here, and the view options, we call them, and it allows you to kind of visualize the UVs in different ways. For example, each UV is presented by blue color. If I left click or right click rather on this button, we can see each shell is getting a different color. Now I'm gonna right click on it again, left click rather, to bring it back to the original blue. So right click to color it, left click to see just blue. Or you can always switch back to wireframe so you don't see any color. The reason that I want to see blue, and we're going to talk about it later on, is blue is good. As soon as I'm going to use my scroller to zoom in and right click to pick one UV and W to move. As soon as you overlap, then the color changes to purple, to dark blue, or to red sometimes, which is not good. So we always aim for this light blue color, which is pretty nice. Now I'm gonna zoom back, switch back to object mode. So make sure to familiarize yourself with the user interface. Let's talk about visual feedback. So what type of visual feedback are we getting? So the first visual feedback was the shaded that I was talking about. So pale blue represents faces that are not overlapping or back facing. Now you can see right off the bat, if I do that, if I click on, for example, this, you can see that this UV is terrible. So we have 0 to 1, that's fine, but as soon as I enable my visual feedback, it's all over the place. It's not even usable. If you want to apply texture to this model later on, you just can't. So I'm going to give you only 4 steps to follow, and it kind of works on any model that you create in ANI 171 or similar units of studies. Later on, you will add to these 4 steps, you will expand those 4 steps, and you may even use different tools to UV unwrap a model quicker. But for now, this works. The method that I'm about to teach you works perfectly fine. Now, the very first step, we apply a tool name projection. Now I'm going to go to a clean scene, go to UVs and tear it off, bring it to the side. All the projections are in here. So I've got automatic, best plane camera, contour, stretched and normal, cylindrical, planar, and spherical. These are my projections. Now the first one that I truly like is planar. Now if I have, let's say, a sphere, this sphere comes with a default UVs, but we don't necessarily use the default UVs. We want to apply our own UV. So planar mapping projects in a given axis or from a selected camera. So if I go, I can use projection from here, so UV projection as I explained before, or I can go to create and the projections are here too. There's no option box here. I usually hold down shift and click and it brings the option box. So for planar I hold down shift click, and we need to think about project from what axis. It can be Y, Z, or X. In a sphere, it really doesn't matter. What we want to have is keep image width height ratio, and we project. Now it creates a plane. You see that plane? And projects it on to the model and creates a 2D representation out of it. You can actually click on those gizmos and change the height width ratio, which we kind of don't want. You can select the middle one, move it around, but it goes beyond 0 to 1, so we don't want that either. Or you can actually click on that and you have access to axis handles for further tweaking. Now that's the first step to UV mapping, to project. Now this is planar. Let's very quickly explore other types of projections. The other type of projection is a cylindrical projection. So if I switch back to object mode and go view cylindrical, this time I'm not using this, I'm using drop down. With the object selected, I go cylindrical. Now instead of a planar projection, I'm getting a cylindrical projection. Again, gizmos work the same. This one goes way beyond 0 to 1. Certainly not one of my favorite projections. I can just click and wrap around the model and it fixed everything within 0 to 1. Not exactly, because we can see there are some leftovers that we need to manually fix. I'm just gonna enable the checkerboard. We can see around here it's not too bad. It's still a bit stretched, to be honest with you. The problem is the poles here and here. Terrible. So we need to apply another projection to the components of these two tips. All right, so it really depends on the model. I don't use that a lot. Now another type, switch back to object mode. Another type is spherical. Now spherical, as the name suggests, is for spherical models like this sphere. We're getting the same colors, same handles. I'm just going to select the red one and left click, drag to the left. And there is another one, the green one, and wrap the whole thing around the model. Still, there are some leftovers. If I click away or go to the object mode, we can see it's not really that great. We've got a bit of a zigzag going on, not to mention the top is not. It's very pinched and compressed, so it's not a really good projection, at least not for this case. You can see U is pretty stretched. And then we have automatic projection when Maya does this for us, of course. So shift, click on automatic, and Maya says, how many shells do you want? We say, well, let's go with 4. Fewer pieces or less distortion? There's a trade-off that you need to be mindful of. I always set it to fewer pieces because distortion I can fix with a tool or two. So project. Now I get 4 pieces, but the problem with that is there's not much distortion, but textile density is terrible. So some of these guys are like so, and the others are really well laid out. And we've got seams all over the place, which is pretty bad. And every time you have a seam, then the texture breaks. So if you have a tileable pattern like this checkerboard, If I click away, we can see the texture is not really that consistent. We've got a really almost close to no continuity around the model, which is pretty bad. So sometimes for quick and dirty work, you just apply automatic. At least it preserves everything into 0 to 1 nicely, and you can pick to have a fewer shells, but it's had its own flaws. So the most reliable way of doing this for me is usually planar, but again, feel free to explore the rest of them and see what you get. You may have a different experience with other types of projections. Now let's go ahead and apply a planar projection. Again, x-axis, keep image width height ratio, insert projection before deformation, bounding box, project. And this is what I'm getting. Now, you may have noticed that this angle is pretty good, but other angles are quite, for example, around here it's terrible, around here it's terrible, not to mention half of my sphere is red, which we talked about already, is not good. But this leads me to the second step after projection, and that is to place our cut. Now, to place our cut, we switch from UV editor to the 3D viewport, and we switch to component mode and edges. So I try to find a good area to place my cut. It really doesn't matter for a sphere. You just need to make sure that that cut goes all the way around your model. So if you have a character, that cut needs to be a closed loop. It can be all around the character, it can be around the finger, around the thigh, around the nose, but it has to be a closed selection. So if I leave one here by accident, my cut is incomplete. You cannot detach it from the model. Just be careful of that. So I always switch back to number 4 to make sure that it's a closed loop, and then switch back to 6. So with my selection active, I go here in my UV editor and shift right click, place my cut. As soon as I do that, if I disable the feedback and disable the checkerboard, you may have noticed that I'm getting a thicker line here thanks to this really good button that shows me where my cut is. Time to select my UV shell and move it to the side. Now I have 2 UV shells. We talked about how to flip a red UV shell. So we right click, we go to UVs, control right click to UV shell, shift right click, flip it. Now watch this video over and over again if those steps are too quick or they don't make sense at a time. Now I have 2 UV shells. If I enable my checkerboard, we can see at least both sides are blue now. My problem at the moment is the areas that I have stretching. So first step, apply projection. Second step, implement or place your cut. Third step is to do something we called unfold. Now unfold is a necessary step that you need to go through, and is a tool that will take an existing UV shell and attempt to lay out its UVs while minimizing distortion. A lot of automated process for you. This can be used to reduce distortion on an unwrapped shell right here. How to use it? Well, you select a shell. As usual, shift right click, you go to unfold. Let's pay a visit to its option box. So your settings matches mine. I'm going to reset. Make sure that UV unfold 3D is checked. Iteration can be set to 1 or higher and apply. Now, all of a sudden, we see that the distortion that we had is gone. That's really good. I'm going to select the UV shell. I can go to UV unfold and do that manually. Now, there's a bit of an angle going on here. I can go to arrange, orient the shell, and then I orient them nicely. Now, the final step is to move them into 0 to 1. I can do it manually, or there's a tool for it, which is my fourth step. I can lay them out in U, which is horizontal, in V, which is vertical, or layout, which does it for both horizontal and vertical. There you go. So that's completely been automated. Just going to scale it down a little, and there we have it. No distortion anywhere. And that's how you UV map an object. Now, I'm going to show you a really quick demonstration of those 4 steps on this model now as a recap. But I'm going to be quick. If you think this is quick, go back and watch those steps. Projection, cut, unfold, layout. Again, this is for unwrapping very basic models. For more complex models, definitely we add or insert or inject more steps into these 4 and make them 8 steps, sometimes 10 steps. So I'm just going to bring this little guy here, isolate it, and think about what would be the best way to decompose this. So I'm thinking this part can be the projection can go into this, both top and bottom. So I can have 1 shell, 2 shells, and the main body 3 shells. This means that the cut goes in here, the cut goes in here, and of course to lay this one out I need to have a cut from bottom to top, so I can just unwrap it, like unwrapping a candy. So I can see a flattened version of it. Now, first step, projection. Well, you may ask what axis? Y, X, or Z, which is not really that different from X. So I would like to see the bigger portion of my model. So I'm going to go planar. Definitely not Y. It can just stay at X. I have my projection. Now, it hasn't been UV, it's been UV mapped, this part, but we need to think about, all right, we're going to unfold it, but before unfolding, we need to cut. So I'm just going to zoom in, go to edge, select the very last edge, shift double click to get all the edges around, switch back to 4, to make sure it goes all over or all around the object. Correct. Switch back to UV editor, shift right click, cut. I can actually select this UV shell and move it aside. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom. I can just go to the edge mode, click, shift, double click, shift right click, cut, and then go to UV shell with right click, W, move tool, move it back. Now, it leaves me with this little guy in the middle. All I need is to plant a cut for this as well. So, remember, if I just double click, look what it does. It goes all over. I don't want that. I just want to have it on this middle section only. So I hold down Control and try to deselect areas that I don't want. So I'm just going to deselect this bit, then going to move up, and I'm going to deselect this bit. Fantastic. Shift right click, cut. Now, let's go ahead and unfold this to begin with. Shift right click, unfold. Fantastic. I go to arrange and orient my shell. If I go to checkerboard, and of course I need to press 6 on it, we can see it looks great. Now, time to take care of this and this, and basically have a good UV shell. Now you may ask, do I need to project from Y again for these two? Well, let's have a look. If I go to this UV shell and just apply unfold, Maya actually is going to recognize that it needs to flip this and unfold it, which is pretty neat. I'm going to do the same thing here. Unfold. Now, textile density. Be very mindful of that. So I know for a fact that this sphere is very small for the main body. So I'm going to bring it over, and don't be too concerned about 0 to 1. We're going to fix it as our 4th step, but this goes like so. And this one, you can just manually resize it, and to be more accurate, I'm just going to bring it over here. Again, in layout, if I shift right click to go to layout, there's a really good option here. It says shell prescaling preserve 3D ratio, which is extremely useful. You can use that too. I'm going to select all 3 and go to layout. Done. So 0 to 1, 0 to 1. I'm using a really good proportion here, so real estate is very strong. Textile density is very accurate, and if I go and click and go to the option box, so I don't see the viewport that much. Yeah, you can see that it's laid out beautifully. So keep practicing those 4 steps. Try to get better and better at it. Things to be mindful of is to understand how to lay out, how to unfold, how to place cuts so the texture is not ruined, and what axis to project from to get the highest proportion of any model. Just keep that in mind that, for example, a model like this, if you want to apply projection, you can apply several projections to different components. For example, this face can be a cylindrical projection, while the rest of it can be a planar projection. So you can apply different projections to different components. That's totally fine, and then you lay them out when you select them and unfold them. Now, I hope you find this useful. We gotta practice more to understand it better, but to gain confidence and to be able to apply for a quicker UV unwrapping, please make sure to just pick random objects and try to UV unwrap them as much as possible. Thank you guys for watching and listening, and see you in the class.